Hello, welcome to the Charity Impact Podcast, the in-depth podcast for people working in the charity sector or more broadly to achieve social impact. We love to hear from our listeners, so please do engage with us on LinkedIn and Twitter. Also, if you subscribe to our emails via the website, you'll find out in advance who our upcoming guests will be, and you can submit your questions for me to ask. I'm Alex Blake, your podcast host, and I'm joined today by Ben Lindsay OBE, author, pastor, activist, and founder of Power the Fight, a charity he launched in 2019 to end youth violence. So we're going to be discussing the issue of youth violence and the related systemic issues, race as an issue in our sector, and also Ben's experience of setting up and running Power the Fight in its first 4 years or so. So welcome to the podcast, Ben. How are you today?
Yeah, I'm great. Thank you for having me. Yeah, it's sunny at the moment, so that is a good thing. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a bit more mixed up here, up in the north. But yeah, it's a fairly nice morning.
Yeah, that's good.
All right, so you've been working on this issue for like 20 years or more now in various roles, mainly in Southeast London. And fun fact for our listeners, which I didn't realise until we spoke recently, was that we went to the same school just a few years apart from each other. So that was fun to learn. And we're going to start off talking about youth violence, getting into the context of that issue. And I was just curious, like, obviously it was an issue back when we were at school in the 90s and it still is today. So I'm just interested, like, what do you think's changed over that time, or maybe what stayed the same? And then just if you can set out what the sort of current situation is around the issue as you see it.
Yeah, no, it's a great question actually. And the first thing I'll say is there's a debate actually in our sector, which is how do you frame, what do you say about violence and young people? So lots of people will say youth violence, but that is a dangerous phrasing of it, because I think you can then think is that, you know, somehow violence is separated generationally, when actually violence is violence. So something which we tend to say is violence affecting young people. So it just separates it out a little bit, which is more of a technical thing. So you may well, as we talk, just refer it as violence affecting young people. I think in terms of the last 20 years, as you know, as you said, we both went to the same school in Southeast London, and I think you probably agree that there was violence around us. You know, that particular area where we grew up, we had Stephen Lawrence was killed a mile away from our school. We had, or at least in my year, because there's a bit of a gap between us, we had kind of triads. We had the National Front. We had Peckham Boys. You know, we had a real mix of different groups of people who also got involved in violence. So it was a real mixed bag. So it's always there. I think what has changed in 20 years is the frequency and the levels of anxiety and fear that young people have. So I never went to school thinking, is this the day I'm going to get robbed? Is this the day I'm going to get stabbed? Is this the day I'm going to get hurt? There was always a risk of that, but it wasn't something which was always on my mind. I think when you talk to young people in 2023, there is this ongoing concern which creates trauma, where there's an expectancy that something's going to happen, even if you are not connected. When you talk to the average young person, you'd say, oh yeah, I've been approached for my phone, or I've been, you know, robbed, or, you know, there's been an attempt to rob me. That's not something which was a daily occurrence for me when I was at school. And I think in the last 20 years, when you include how technology has changed, how social media has come into play, how imagery and videos of violence is now more accessible, I think that then causes young people to have a lot more issues around their well-being and mental health, which then leads to fear, which then in turn possibly leads to some young people feeling, if I carry a knife, if I carry a weapon, I am more protected. So you've got all these multiple kind of issues which can lead to that. And I think the other thing worth mentioning, which is really important, is in the last 20 years, the level of youth services has decreased. £1.5 billion have come off local authorities across the country since austerity in 2010, 2011, which has meant there's been now a lack of youth workers, lack of youth service, lack of provision. You take also 44,000 police officers off the streets of England. That also has an impact as well. So there's a few things there where you're like, okay, the resources are no longer there. The pressure on the people who are meant to be keeping us safe increases. And as a result of that, we're now in a mess where in 2021, we had the highest rate of knife crime, fatalities in the UK like ever. And 30 plus young people were murdered in the London context. And that is just, it's crazy, it's ridiculous. So it's definitely changed. I think we just haven't moved, we haven't advanced, we haven't learned the changing culture of youth culture as it has changed and impacted people and young people and families and communities in a really devastating way.
The other thing I was curious about as well, because I now live outside of London, I'm up in Newcastle, and I suppose often when these sorts of things are being discussed on the news and stuff, like, it is quite London centric in terms of a lot of the incidents happening. I know that's where you guys work predominantly. But I was curious, like, what's the difference outside of London, or and outside of major cities? Is it like Birmingham and Manchester might have some very similar issues, like somewhere like Newcastle or some of the sort of smaller cities and towns? Is it the same sort of issue for young people, or is there a different context?
Well, I think there's always, context is a really important word here. So I think you're always gonna have different cultural contexts depending on the location. But in reality, it isn't just a London issue. It isn't just a Black issue. In a London context, by the nature of the demographic and the ethnic makeup of London, this is something which disproportionately impacts Black and brown communities. But interestingly, when you look at it from a UK perspective, the highest rates of knife crime, the top three places, number one is West Midlands. And then number two is a place which is actually very close to where you are, Cleveland.
Right.
So, which I think you'd have to help me here, but first kind of it's northeast, it's Middlesbrough,
yeah,
Castle, and that's fascinating for me to be able to think, gosh, that's not somewhere which is in London. It's somewhere which has a demographic which is an ethnic makeup of 98% white people.
Yeah.
Yet it's the second highest rate of knife crime in the country. And then number three will be London. So definitely what I would say is that when you go outside of London, like, violence doesn't discriminate in terms of geography. I think it does discriminate in terms of class. I think there's something rare which we often don't want to talk about. We don't want to have the nuanced conversation about, how violence affecting young people can impact working class communities. But it's definitely not just a London issue. There's a youth culture issue. When you talk about the drug trade, which sometimes often leads to increased violence, you would have heard about county lines, drug lines being set up outside of major cities. And I think what we do have, as I said before, is a youth culture issue. And I think how technology spreads. So when we were growing up, we didn't have WhatsApp, Whereas now, for example, the way information moves, the way young people can migrate across the country and get communication across the country is in a way which is a lot quicker than what we would have had 20 years ago. What a young person may well be into, listening to, influenced by in a London context, for example, doesn't just stay to London now. That could be a young person in the valleys of Wales, could be into exactly the same things. So there's this transient culture now, which means that every young person will be experiencing the same things. And I think that's something just to bear in mind. So I think it's a UK wide issue. It's not the common denominators, and it's not about race. The common denominators tend to be poverty, poor mental health, high school exclusions, increase in substance misuse, where the drug trade is. You know, these are the common denominators which can lead to violence. You know, as a result of that, you can't just say it's one particular geographic area's issue or one particular ethnicity's issue. It's a UK wide concern.
Yeah. And thinking about how we can address the issue more. I know you've talked about some of the kind of related systemic issues there are. What are the sorts of things that need to happen in different parts of the system, and like how can we tackle that kind of complexity?
Yeah, so the thing about the charity which I set up, which I know we'll talk about a bit more later, is that for us, we had to look at this on two levels, what we'd call the ground, which is, okay, what is the community going through? What are their experiences? What are where their voices being heard? And match that to what we call the air. Okay, the decision makers, the legislation, the local and central government, mayoral decisions, where's the funding kind of going? So what we felt, there was a conduit missing, someone in the middle of that ground air to communicate those experiences up. So I think it's one of these things where we're saying, okay, on a systemic systems, air engagement level, where are the resources going? You know, if 1.5 billion have come off in the last 10 years, we're kind of working in a deficit model, right? So where are the resources going? And that's why we work very closely with local government, central government, and the Mayor of London through the violence reduction units to try and help that. Then there's also a conversation about, okay, when we're looking at the criminal justice system and we're looking at the young people who get caught up in the criminal justice system, there's a link to school exclusions and poor mental health. So again, a lot of our work is based on going beyond the headlines. You see the headlines of a young person has lost their life, but we often don't get to the question of, well, how did they get to that point, or how did the person who used the weapon get to that point? So for us, it's very much about early intervention. And that's why we believe that in the school context, it's really important to have what we would call culturally sensitive therapists and culturally sensitive psychologists and culturally sensitive youth practitioners who really understand the culture and the context that they're working in and can offer young people an opportunity to really express their feelings and their emotional health and their well-being. And also help teachers understand the context and the culture they're in, and also provide spaces for parents and carers as well. So you're getting this kind of holistic approach. So there's a school conversation, there's a resource and funding conversation. There's an enforcement conversation as well. How are the police treating our young people? Are they being stigmatized? Is there are they being racialized? Is there things and biases which are not actually helping young people flourish? And these are the things that also need to be addressed. So there's these multiple issues: the well-being, the anxiety of families and young people, the ongoing aftermath of when a murder does happen in the community, and that has ripple effects which can go on for years and decades. How the criminal justice system deals with families who have lost young people and the perpetrators. You know, there's all these multiple kind of levels which need to be addressed, which at the moment it doesn't feel like there is a space where you can say, actually, let's look at it from an air engagement perspective, let's look at it from a ground engagement. But ultimately you want early intervention and you want resources. And just to be clear, I think when we do talk about systems, I think sometimes you can think, well, does that mean that we're taking away from personal responsibility? Not at all. I think the reality is there's some dangerous people out there who do need to be locked away because they are causing mayhem and death and pain to communities. But I also feel there needs to be an opportunity for rehabilitation. And I think we need to also try and get to the very roots of what we're dealing with. There's this thing called ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, which really, if you look at a lot of the people who are in the criminal justice system, they would have gone through so much stuff. They would have seen parents who may have been into substance misuse, poor mental health, maybe incarcerated, you know, are criminals themselves, and seen domestic violence. And then you wonder why those children are the more problematic ones. We don't often want to have those conversations. So yeah, so that was a long answer, but there's multiple kind of reasons why we're in this mess.
Yeah, I think that was the gist of the question. Is that this is a complicated issue. It's not a case of you know, just being about young people carrying knives and attacking each other. It's, you know, all of, as you say, all the experiences they've had, and then really often, you know, they've been let down, you could say, really by the schools, and, you know, unhelpful attitudes within the police and so on. So yeah, I guess, as you say, it's that early intervention, isn't it? It's trying, you know, it's changing some of those aspects of the system. You know, there've been how many reports on the Met Police and their kind of issues that could be dealt with, and then in schools, obviously, if kids are getting the support they need there, then
the systems, like, you know, we've just had the Casey report come out around the police. You know, the levels of school exclusions that we've seen, which tends to impact Black and brown communities, and white working class communities as well, in a way which is disproportionate. These things need to be addressed. And, you know, pupil referral units as well. There are some good pupil referral units out there, but there are also a lot of pupil referral units which just are breeding grounds for more, you know, complex behavior, and in some cases criminality. So we have to address these things. Otherwise, what you are effectively doing is just putting a plaster over a gunshot wound, and it's not ever going to heal, right? You're not addressing, and this is why the public health approach, which became very famous in Scotland, where, you know, Glasgow at one point had the highest murder rate in Europe, and then they decided in 2005 to start this public health approach, which was really looking at this thing from a health issue as opposed to an enforcement issue, and bringing in multiple different institutions to try and address this issue. And one of the interesting things was that they had a zero exclusions policy. And with that zero exclusions policy, it meant that actually the murder rate reduced by 80%, because somebody connected the dots to say, well, if you're excluding children and they're no longer in a system which is caring, that can lead to criminality. They pinpointed that. Now, the problem with in this country, in England, I don't think you're ever going to get a zero exclusions policy, because when you start talking about this with head teachers, they automatically assume you're saying, you're taking the power away from me to exclude children which I think are causing disruption in my school. I don't think it's that. I think it's more a case of, can we create more therapeutic support in school so those kids who are more challenging get an on-site therapeutic support, as opposed to being sent somewhere else where the provisions are not as good. And I think there's a kind of fine line and a difference there.
Oh yeah, it's a tough one, isn't it? To be fair to the teachers as well, when they've got a class of 30 kids and they've got to try and support all of them, and there's one or two that, as you say, have those more difficult behaviours, then it's
And as a
finding
parent,
how to
as a
support
parent,
them.
you want that as well, right? As a parent,
Oh
someone's
yeah,
one kid and that kid is disrupting everything, your automatic thinking would be, I want that kid out. But then when we don't think about is, well, what trajectory are we putting that child on?
please excuse this brief interruption. I just want to say thank you for taking the time to listen to our podcast and to ask a small favour. The whole point of the podcast is to help people working for social impact by sharing the experience and knowledge of our awesome guests. Please can you help by letting people know this free resource is worth a listen? A great way to do this is by taking a few seconds to give us a rating in your podcast player. You can just click the 5 stars and that would be amazing. Or if you could write a few words to say what you like about the show, that would be even better. The link ratethispodcast.com/charity will take you to the right place and show you how to do it. That link again is ratethispodcast.com/charity. If there isn't a rating option where you listen, you can always give us a shout out on social media. Thanks for listening. Race has come up in the context of youth violence and how people view that. What's your experience been in setting up the charity and being a charity CEO and interacting with, as you say, those kind of different parts of the system, and also then needing to go and talk to funders and things like that? What's your experience been in that sense?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it's quite helpful that I've been in this space for 20 plus years, and that has been in multiple guises, as working in youth offending service, and I was a learning mentor, and I was managing part of community safety teams in Camden and South London, North London, mental health charities. I was a pastor for 12 years as well. So in the community, in the space that I've been working in and living in and serving, I think my reputation working with leaders, MPs, leaders in councils, mayors and whatever, has meant that actually by the time I launched Power to Fight, I wasn't starting from zero, starting from a place where I felt I had a good understanding of the sector that I was about to come into. So walking into that, I felt confident that I had something which was a slight different and variation to what was out there already. Saying that though, it definitely wasn't as straightforward as I thought it was going to be. You start in 2019, and the first thing in my mind, I'm thinking, well, you launch a charity and that's when you start getting the money. Whereas what actually happened in reality was that I launched a charity once we got it past the charity commission and it was all signed off. And then now I'm applying for support and foundations and grants. People started saying, well, you need 1 year's worth of accounts before you can actually apply. And I'm like, well, how am I going to get 1 year's worth of accounts if I've got nothing? I've just started. Yeah. Then you're like, oh, okay, this isn't straightforward, and you have to go into kind of like this hustling mentality. And unfortunately, how I was able to raise and fundraise and get some extra money was because of my connections within the church. And I was able to kind of say, listen, you've heard me speak about violence affecting young people. You've seen me have to do services for families who've lost children. You know how important this is. And so we were able to raise some money from the churches as I suppose a bit of a startup. I think what I found though was definitely something which is something which I've seen throughout my career. There's a conversation about what is funded and how it's funded and how that money is distributed to organizations which are grassroots and are often Black-led. So one of the things which I realized was that actually when it comes to trying to get money from funders, there's a real lack of understanding about Black-led organizations and the communities that they're serving, And I suppose the question is this equity conversation, that so many of the organizations which are engaging with issues which impact Black and brown communities are doing work which isn't funded very well. So I found myself in a situation where you found that the bigger charities and the bigger organizations were getting a lot of money, and then what they would do is almost subcontract out to organizations like myself. So I was like, well, that doesn't really make sense, because you're not doing the work, but you have the reputation. So I had to fight a lot to get the trust. And I felt that actually being one of the few Black-led organizations, CEOs in this space, I had to fight harder than maybe some of my peers. And so I learned a lot in the first year, and there was ways I kind of got around that quickly. But yeah, I think one of the things I realized is that you have to make your organization look bigger than it is,
Right.
which is not deception at all. But one of the things I said was, right, we're going to make the website and we're going to make the branding something which looks so professional and so slick that when you look at what Power the Fight brings, you're going to think we're bigger than we are. And that's what we did. And I always say I run Power the Fight very much like a record label. It's kind of like, you know, if you know, you put out a single to promote the album. Well, for me, I'm like, well, we're going to put out reports, and we're going to have an evaluation and a research arm of Power the Fight. And every single thing we're going to evaluate, and every single thing we're going to put out as a report, and that's going to lead to more funding. So we were doing that within 6 months of us launching. And suddenly the sector starts seeing, oh no, these guys are evidence-based, what they're doing, we're going to give them money. And that's kind of what we ended up doing.
Yeah, I think there's a few really smart things there. I mean, the producing the evidence is obviously something that's just worth investing in, because it gives you that credibility. But also, I think your point around investing in the sort of marketing and brand for funders and for others in the sector looking, it just gives a sense of kind of professionalism that gives people confidence to then work with you to fund you and so on. And I think for a lot of community sort of grassroots organizations, funders get an application from them, and it's kind of the stuff might be there in terms of saying that, you know, look, we know our community, we're in it, this is the work we do, it makes a difference and so on. But it's maybe not quite in the professional language that they're used to, maybe. And then they kind of, you know, if they click on the website and it looks like, you know, it's a crap website, you know, it looks rubbish, it looks like it could have been knocked up in half an hour, and it's, you know, and all of that is obviously, you know, partly just down to being under-resourced. But I think it's that perception that, particularly now, like the first thing anyone does to check out any company or any charity is pop on the website. Do they look professional? Do they look credible? Do they look legitimate? Or, you know, if it doesn't look and feel right, then it just puts people off straight away. So I think that's a big thing. And I think that's something that I think a lot of small charities struggle with. And if they're not heard of, then funders look at that and go, like, I don't know, I don't feel confident.
I think that's a really good point. I mean, I think you have to make a decision on what you are going to invest money in your startup. You haven't got an abundance of money. So there's something about trusting your brand and trusting your idea enough to think, if I'm going to invest in branding, it has to then generate the money I believe it can do for us to do everything else. And I was very clear on who I was going for. I was like, listen, I want to be in a position where we're training local authorities and youth offending teams and community safety teams and teachers and NHS and police. And so therefore, the website has to speak to that clientele, which meant was the first iteration of the website was very, it's changed now, but it was black and white. It was kind of like black and white. This is serious stuff. and it worked. But then as time went on, I pivoted a little bit, and I was like, actually, okay, right, we've got kind of the corporate side of it, but there's this whole youth work side which we're doing, the therapeutic support we're doing, the work we're doing with schools, and it's just looking too corporate. So now we need to bring some color in, and our social media needs to represent young people. And also from a donations perspective, what I also realize is that, and this is the bit which is I had to really think this out, that I needed to create a mixed funding model. So, okay, yes, we want contracts, and yes, we want grants, but we also want corporates, and we want donations from individuals. So the individuals, they really want to see the work you're doing with young people.
Yeah.
Okay. The corporates want to make sure they're partnering with somebody to hit their CSR stuff, right? So this means that you're kind of having, depending on who you're talking to, you've got to have something which speaks to why they'd want to engage with you. And I suppose there's the beautiful thing about being an organization the size we are, is that we can be a little bit more flexible, a bit more fluid, and we can pivot quite quickly. But what I'm really proud of is that we do have a mixed funding model, which isn't just reliant on one part of how you can make money from a charity, but that requires a quite nuanced approach to how you are trying to bring investment in.
Yeah, I think it's something that charities often struggle with, because when we talk about brand, the number one thing is like thinking about who your audience is, and then thinking about what your message is, and what channels you use to reach them. And so I suppose often charities think, well, who's my website for? Is it for our service users? Is it for our funders? Is it for the general public? And they're such different audiences. Then, I think that's often where people get a bit unstuck. It's kind of trying to make it something for everyone, and then getting a bit stuck on that. Yes. But I think you're right in terms of trying to pursue that mixed funding model as well. I think lots of smaller charities are predominantly contracts and grants, and I think that's kind of usually, unless you've got a particularly strong network of some kinds that can provide funding, that's usually got to be where you start. But if you can diversify from there, I just think it's often really difficult for smaller charities, because actually, like, the communities they work with are not affluent, so it's difficult for them to kind of tap into people that can provide support and to kind of get that return on investment from that fundraising perspective.
Yeah.
So how are you finding it so far in terms of some of those other income streams?
Yeah, I mean, it's yeah, I mean, I think that point you just made about the communities you're serving are not affluent is such a good one, because yeah, the plan or the aim is never to take money from the communities that you're serving. My whole thing is, how do we give more money to the communities that we're trying to engage with? And so I'm always a bit confused when I see charities almost taking money from the very people they're trying to engage with. I think that's mad. So for me, so much about narrative. I'm a storyteller at heart, in how I write, and even how in the past when I've had to deliver sermons, or when I'm doing training, it's always the story which carries. And I think you just have to have one compelling story and vary it a little bit depending on who you're talking to. So from a Power to Fight perspective, the mixed funding model is, yep, there are traditional foundations and grants funders who we have got partnerships with, which is fantastic. And there are local government contracts and central government contracts and mayoral contracts, but there's also corporates as well. there's these big corporate entities who we are partnering with, which are massive, and some of these things it didn't all start like year one. Some of these things came in like year two, year three. But then there's also how you engage with high net worth individuals as well. So in November we did an event at the House of Lords, which was, because of COVID, it's probably our first kind of in-person event, and we were kind of targeting the tech sector because they've got a lot of money. And fortunately we were able to partner with somebody who was very well respected in the tech world and has made a lot of money in tech, and he brought his links and his connections. And
so sorry to jump in, but just to get into some of the details.
Yeah, sure.
Well, first of all, I'll just go rewind a little bit. I think just to say, for some charities listening, fundraising with the community you serve is all good. I think, if you're a local hospice or you support, particular health condition, like in other sectors, that it absolutely makes sense.
Yes.
But just to jump into your point there, how did you get the relationship with the tech person who was able to kind of invite their other connections and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I was kind of flippantly just said that, didn't I? About I just happened to, millionaire. Yeah. So I think again, so this comes back to understanding your skill set as a CEO, right? So one of the things which I am brilliant at is networking. I always have done since the days of being at school. I was one of the people, I was saying this to my wife recently, I never just associated with one group of people. I was the type of person who I was friends with lots of different people, and I think you bring that skill into this. So when it came to meeting Dean Forbes, who is CEO of Fortero, kind of the whole tech investment world, and it was like £1 billion acquisition. It was quite a big deal in the tech world. Dean is from Southeast London, and it's as simple as we got a mutual friend. Right. So, and I've been talking to her for a while. I was like, you know what, I've set up this charity, see Dean's doing quite well. I just wonder whether he'd be interested in having a conversation. And what was interesting about Dean, so I didn't know him. This is crazy, right? I didn't know him before September 2022. So we finally meet in September 22, and the first thing I say to him is like, I know, I've seen how successful you are. It's really lovely to see a Black man from Southeast London being super successful at what they do. But I want to make it clear, I don't want your money. And he was a bit like, what? And I was like, I don't want your money. I want your networks. So I'm learning when you meet rich people, if you say stuff like that, that piques their interest because normally people just want their money. So he said, what do you want to do? And I said, well, listen, you have links. I have access to places like the House of Lords. Can we do something? And straight away, he just said, yes, I'll bring all my friends. You find the space. Let's do it. And that was September. And we did the event in November. And in that time, we've become really good friends. It's been great. But that's how that situation happened. We've got a partnership with Johnson & Johnson, a corporate 3-year partnership with them. Again, that was random. The person who linked me with that was following me on Instagram, which is also it's a good point. Be careful what you put on Instagram.
Yeah.
It's the best way to get an insight into the person you are investing in, and not just investing in your corporation or your charity, they're investing in you. But that, again, the person says to me, Ben, I've been watching you. Johnson & Johnson have got a fund which is very much about equity for minority communities and mental health. We think Power to Fight could be a good fit. Okay, let's have that conversation. So I think really, I always say this to my son, likability
Yeah.
gets you into more doors than anything else. Like, yes, so I think there's a narrative conversation. Have you got a strong narrative? What is it that you are investing in, and why should I care about your cause? And to be honest, violence affecting young people is probably one of the most difficult things to fundraise for, because it's one of these causes where people will second guess.
Mm.
What I mean by that is, and I was running a half marathon in October, and what's interesting when you're running long distances, your mind goes off in different places at different points. Normally when I get to about 16K, I'm just like, what am I doing? And thinking about all types of things. What's interesting is that I'm, depending on who I tell the story to, I'm either running past people or they're running past me. And all I'm seeing is cancer charities and dog charities. These are the t-shirts I'm watching going past me. And I'm like, whoa, this is crazy. It's like, it's so, there's nothing wrong with those charities. I'm just saying they're easier to fundraise for. And you don't second guess. So someone says, oh, yeah, I'm here for blind dogs. You're not questioning the subject matter. When you say you're fundraising for, violence impacting young people, the first thing a lot of people think is, well, hold on, what did they do? Are they in a gang? As opposed to the empathetic reaction which you sometimes get. So it's complicated. It's not a straightforward charity. Hence the reason why the multiple aspects of fundraising and the mixed funding model is so important for me, because if I just rely on one aspect, I don't think we will be in the successful position that we currently are in.
I think that's, I just wanted to pick up a couple of little detail points for people, because I think, again, like these different income streams are really tricky for small charities to get started with. And I think one of the key things there was like leveraging your network a bit, in terms of you ask someone for an introduction to someone that they know who you know can help your organization. And I think being able to do that requires you to have done some networking in the past. So if you just don't do that, then you're not going to get those opportunities. So sometimes people struggle just because their networks are poor, because they haven't invested in that over the last kind of 20 years. But often people will see that mega successful, wealthy person over there and just want to kind of send them an email directly. And then, they're surprised when they get no response. So I think that's something that those introductions just make your response rate go from like less than 1% up to certainly above 50%, I would say. The key one to pick up on is really building those networks over time and then leveraging them when you can. And that it's a really interesting point about not asking for money, because there's a kind of ask for money and get advice, ask for advice and get money. And I think as a fundraiser, there are times when you do have to make the ask. But I think, there is something there as well about not just turning up and saying, can you give us some money, but thinking about that sort of partnership and what you can do for them and how you can get them involved as you did there. I think that's a really nice example of where you can offer something and you can work together, and it kind of creates more of a relationship that you can build on. So I think those are key things. And then I guess with the corporate one there, you've got a bit lucky. Well, it's come your way, but it's come your way as a result of you doing things. So if you weren't putting the time into those social media channels, then you wouldn't have got that inquiry. So I guess it's I
don't think it's luck. I think it's knowing. So everything I do with Power to Fight on social media is extremely calculated. So it's whatever comes out on. I have a brilliant digital content lead who really understands who we are going for. But then there's also, because I understand that people also invest in individuals, I'm also very calculated on what I put on my personal channels as well. And I think I know how to link. The other thing I would say is, I think maybe what people don't understand is how money works. And what people don't appreciate is how you spread your gaze to understand that money is different in different sectors. So if you just focus on the youth sector and the traditional ways of where that money can come in, you're not gonna, that pound is not gonna land and it's not gonna expand. But if you can suddenly say, well, hold on, the tech world are bringing in billions, the music world are bringing in billions, there's all these brands which are bringing in millions and billions, and all I want is a percentage from each of these different brands, even if it's 0.5% or whatever it is. I don't, but the more of these brands I can connect with, and the more I can make the link between violence affecting young people and how that somehow impacts your brand when you invest in this, before you know it, you suddenly have got a revenue stream which comes in. And it's, whereas sometimes people were like, well, I just need to be focusing on this sector and where this money comes traditionally. It's like, no, the pound goes wider and bigger than that. And you've just got to mind map a bit and think, well, why would Puma want to engage with an organization or a charity like Power to Fight? Well, okay, they might want to engage with us because their target audience are young people. And therefore there's a question on who are the people, who are the talent, as they like to say, who are advertising their product to the young people. And therefore you then start just connecting a little bit like that. And, oh, does Power to Fight have access to these types of young people? Oh yeah, well, we do. Okay, but we've also got a bit of a corporate heart, and we want to make sure that our young people are not being impacted in negative ways by what we're doing. Do you see what I'm saying? So sometimes you just got to connect the dots and the narrative is there. Whereas when I connect with the NHS, it's a whole different conversation. When I talk to the NHS, and we've just got a partnership with the South London and Maudsley Mental Health Trust, it's different. I'm saying to you, you are delivering a mental health trust and a particular project helping families, but the families which you are engaging with don't look like the families who we're working with. So you've got a gap there, which I think Power to Fight can fill. So can we do a partnership where our families can connect him with your expertise, but I also want to be able to train your team because I don't believe you're culturally sensitive enough to actually engage with these families. Oh, yeah, that makes sense. Let's do a partnership and pilot. Do you see what I mean? So I've just pivoted. There's a different way I would talk to a Dean Forbes with Fortero Group, tech billion-pound organization, to how I would then talk to a Puma, to how I would then talk to the NHS. And I don't know if everyone has the ability to pivot like that. But that's the networking side of stuff, right?
Yeah. I think there is that. And I think, I mean, again, it comes down to resourcing partly, comes down to where people choose to kind of spend their time, doesn't it? I know a lot of smaller charity CEOs feel really stretched, and the more classic kind of flow is like, write a grant application, get the money in, forget about that funder until 12 months later. When you spent the money, you've got to submit a report. So there's no real relationship there. And partly that's down to funders wanting it that way as well. They don't particularly want to engage much more than that. But they'll, charities will rely, small charities will rely on that sort of model, and won't think about how they can build more ongoing relationships with which those other partners will want. Like if you're going to develop those corporate partnerships, they're going to want to see what they're getting for their money, aren't they? Rather than, just getting a report in a year's time.
Yeah, I think it's funny with corporates, like some of them are less headaches than traditional grants, for good or bad.
Oh yeah.
They give you the money and they slap your logo on their website. They've ticked a box, right?
Yeah, I think it's where.
But most of the corporates I do work with actually want more. They're kind of like, well, can we
Yeah,
offer you pro bono stuff as well?
yeah.
Can we actually engage on that on a real, like, actually help us get our culture right?
Yeah.
So most of the ones we wouldn't just, we're not the type of people who just take money without having like a real kind of ethical conversation, and a challenge to see, well, yeah, it's not everything we would take money from. And that's the other thing that's tricky. When some organizations have offered you a lot of money and like your ethics and the ethos doesn't match ours.
Yeah.
Systems are all over the place.
But I think the thing is, if you take the money and don't do much afterwards, then you might get that $5,000, 20 grand, whatever it might be, and it's a one-off, and there's no, nothing else happens. Whereas if you have those multiple layers to that, and with corporates, it's about having a partnership rather than just getting a grant, isn't it? So it's, if you can go in and do some training or give some talks with their staff, if you can do some brand stuff, do some stuff on social media and things like that, and find different ways to engage, but kind of skilled pro bono volunteering, all of those things build that relationship. So they're more likely to then support you again the following year. And if you can keep doing and that's, I suppose, where it, if the partnership makes sense, if there is that kind of alignment between the brands and there are genuine ways for them to support the charity and for you to offer something to them as well, then there's no reason why it can't keep continuing each year. Whereas if it's a bit more forced and it's kind of like you're finding something for some employees to do rather than having a genuine kind of role for them to fill in that pro bono sense, then it, it's you're then needing to spend more time managing that to happen than it would be. You wouldn't want it to be continuing year after year because you're kind of having to find things for them to do.
Yeah, good.
I realise we've ended up talking loads and loads about just the fundraising and marketing side of things, and I had a bunch of other stuff on the list. In terms of the programs you've developed, how have they kind of developed and evolved? Maybe you can say briefly what the kind of key aspects of work you do, how that's evolved over the last few years, like what you've learned along the way and how that's kind of influenced how things have adapted as you've gone along.
Yeah, we launched 2019. And as I kind of said before, the evaluation side and evidence base of the work that we do was always going to be a massive feature for us. So a key moment was the end of 2019 where we were able to get some money from the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan's Violence Reduction Unit, to do a pilot therapeutic support in a school, local school in South East London. It wasn't a massive amount. Well, I say it wasn't a massive amount. It was £50,000 for 3 months, to start in March 2020. So I built a small team. I got like a team, a clinical lead. I've got a youth practitioner. I've got a counsellor, and I've got my evaluator from a criminologist from university, and we were going to be the delivery team, effectively going in to schools to see if this idea of therapeutic support for young people, teachers and staff and parents worked. So that was all going, and then obviously 2020 comes just as we're about to kick off. It's a little thing called a pandemic happens, which means we can't get into schools. And at that moment, you have to make a decision quite early in the lifespan of the charity. Do you furlough yourself and park this until the pandemic's over? Or do you think, which we ended up doing, like, actually, I don't know what's going to happen, but it feels like actually young people are going to probably need us now more than ever. So let's just go for it. And what we did, we pivoted. And this is something which I do thank the Mayor of London for allowing us to do this, but also as a smaller organisation, you can do, where we said, listen, we can't deliver the service, but I wonder whether we could turn it into a research project where we can really ask the question to young people and families and practitioners, their engagement with therapeutic support and how culturally competent it was. they agreed, the VRU and the Mayor of London agreed, and it turned into a research project. And then in September 2020, we released the report, this Therapeutic Intervention for Peace report, looking at culturally competent therapeutic services and the approach. And we interviewed 102 young people, 5 in-depth interviews with families impacted by violence, and 20 interviews with practitioners on the front line. And that one report, which came out in September 2020, absolutely informed and impacted our sector, where suddenly the language started changing around therapy and cultural competency and cultural sensitivity. And from that report, we were then able to get money from the Home Office, from the Violence Reduction Unit, from other grants, to then allow us to pilot this work. And so we piloted it in January 2021. And then as we've gone on, we've been more established in schools across London. So that's the therapeutic arm of the work. The other arm was the training side of it. And, you know, we, as I said earlier on, well, I don't know if I've said this actually, we've trained over 13,000 practitioners in the last 4 years. And again, the pandemic worked for us because we were able to train so many people online.
Yeah.
And
when you say practitioners, Ben, is that like health, education? What sort of roles, what practitioners
so
are
we're talking about teachers, we're talking about GPs, we're talking about surgeons, we're talking about youth workers, police officers, community members, faith groups, anyone who's engaging with young people effectively, really. And some of that training would include, how do you become a more culturally sensitive organization? And what's your understanding around county lines? Introductions to understanding about violence affecting young people, gang exit strategies, specifics around violence against affecting women and girls, all the things, contextual safeguarding, all these things which the sector kind of know, but actually not many people are trained in this stuff. And that, again, has become a very profitable arm of the charity, to the point where last year when I've employed now a head of training, and she's got her own team now, and that training is up and down the country. So that, again, was something which kind of grew. We also support families who have lost young people, so we've given over 30.
Sorry to interrupt you again, but just out of interest, just with the training, because I know that's something that lots of small charities, they have that expertise, and they're like, this should be something we can create a training product and sell, but then really struggle to execute in terms of actually then like selling the training and getting the people booked on and making any money out of it, and particularly making any kind of profit from it. So what do you think is, like, what worked in terms of getting started and managing to train so many people? Were there like any particular things that catalyzed that?
Yeah, definitely. So one of the things, and this comes back down to networking, when we first started, I basically were able to pinpoint and ask the best well-known people in the sector for those specific topics. So, for example, when it comes to contextual safeguarding, the name in our sector who is the person who pioneered that is Professor Carlin Furman at Durham University. She's someone I've known for years. I just said, listen, I need you to be a trainer for me. I'll happily pay you. Can you lead on this? Yes. Okay. When it came to gang exit strategies, a guy from Birmingham called Craig Pinkney was the person who I knew was doing a PhD on this type of stuff, and I've worked with in the past. Craig, can you be the lead on this? No problem. And, you know, Temi Mawali, who runs Forefront Project, I said, listen, your understanding on the legal system and the race dynamics and some of this stuff, could you do a training for me on this? So suddenly what we had was this roster of trainers across London, across the UK, who were well known in the sector, who all came under Power to Fight. And it wasn't all about me. I mean, I delivered some training, but when you saw this, it was like, oh gosh, no, we know these people are. And so that ended up generating money. But if I'm honest, it didn't bring in a lot of money in the early days, you know. What then really started bringing in the money was when local authorities will come to you. Vending service will say, can you train our team here? Can you train our team there? And that started happening a lot more. I mean, across the country, you know, Cardiff Youth Offenders, so could you train our whole team on this particular issue here? And then you'd start building it into contracts as well. Okay, well, we've now got a contract with the school to deliver the therapeutic side of stuff, but we also want to train the teachers. Can we build it into this point as well? So then it's become its own entity and its own arm of Power to Fight.
And is most of it done online, or are you going in and doing it in person as well?
Some of it's done online, but most of it's done in person now.
Okay. And so those sort of well-known sort of leaders in the field that you got, so did you have to pay for their time to kind of create the training content, and then are they still delivering all of it? So you get that call from Cardiff and then like you get your team together, or how's that working logistically?
We always paid them. I've definitely made it a key thing where this wasn't a favor, you know, their time. I mean, they gave me a bit of a discount, but I paid them. But now, 4 years in, actually, we don't use them as much because we have a training team who are skilled in those particular topics. We still use them every now and again, and depending on who we've partnered with, there might be a very specific type of training where we like to actually, but we've also done partnerships now with the Contextual Safeguarding Network, who are based at Durham University, where we are one of their deliverers as well. So there's just different ways that you can make sure the money, with the NHS partnership that we've got with SLAM, there's a training arm connected to that, and there's a part of money which goes into that as well. So yeah, it's just one of those things there, really.
All right, thanks. That's really interesting. I did cut you off though, so I think you talked about the therapeutic stuff, and then you're talking about the training. I think you're just about to move on to something else.
Well, I think the other thing, there's two quick things really. One, the other thing which helped kind of going back to the single and the album and analogy, where it was like the single really is the way to promote the album which is coming. For Power to Fight, we were like, how do we promote the work that we do? So our podcasts, our Power Talks was the thing that we did. We got 4 seasons of those. And the first season was, I interviewed the best people in the sector to get an understanding of what they do, but also to promote the work that we do. So that was the single. The single went out. It went out and everybody was liking it and sharing it, and it was brilliant. And it was a free resource, which people still use today. But it also then meant it was advertising. Because then when people went on our website and they were like, oh, actually, I wouldn't mind some training on contextual safeguarding or whatever, there it was right there. So that was a very useful way of promoting the organization wider, because it isn't just about go to our website. It's like, oh no, this is a resource which is being shared and it's branded. The other thing, which is something which comes out of our reserves, there is no funding stream for this, is the money which we give to families who have lost loved ones to violence. So we've given over £30,000 to 60 families, but that is coming out of our reserves. That is us doing that ourselves, which I think is important, but also demonstrates where there's a gap in the sector for supporting families in the aftermath of violence. So there's multiple strings to what we do, and depending on what you want to fund, a funder can look at that and be like, actually, we want to fund this particular aspect of it.
I think we've done a good amount of time, Ben, so we'll start wrapping up. In terms of resources that we can share with people, and obviously you've got the podcasts and the reports on the website, so we can share that. What else might there be? What do you think's worth letting people know about? We can put the links on the website.
Yeah, definitely. Just go to our website at www.powertofight.org.uk. There's lots of resources on there. There's lots of opportunities to be trained. There's some toolkits. You know, there's ways that you can there's like letters, templates to your MPs where you can kind of engage if you want to really kind of ask the question about what are your local authorities really doing around this issue around violence affecting young people. There's campaigns which we are engaging with at the moment around mental health and emotional well-being of young people, which will be all over our social media at the moment. So there's many things that you can get involved in.
Cool. And I know I really enjoyed your TEDx talk as well. So I'll stick the link to that.
Oh yeah, I
on there.
forgot about that.
It's probably a few years ago, I think, but it's really
no,
good.
It's only a year ago. It's only
okay.
Yeah, we did it. I did it in April last year, and yeah, that TEDx talk is really interested in understanding like the therapeutic work that we do and where we got to that. So definitely that is a good resource.
Yeah, it's just like a nice short way into kind of understanding some of the issues and stuff there. Are there any resources that you kind of use yourself that you'd recommend to like other charity CEOs or founders or that sort of thing?
There's some good books actually. I'm just looking at my bookshelf at the moment. There's one book there's many books, but the Inclusive Leadership book by Charlotte Sweeney and Fleur Bothwick is something which is just I found very helpful in terms of how you build like truly inclusive organizations, and that's a book I refer back to, which I think is quite helpful. One of the things which I've definitely found in terms of understanding people, we've used those like psychometric testing. We've used Strength Scope, which is a good thing for us to be able to refer back to, giving you an idea of where we are in terms of if the organization, about strengths and weaknesses and stuff, but also as individuals. So that is also a helpful tool. What else can I recommend? I mean, what we haven't really spoken about is just the culture that we're trying to build as well. So we're trying to build a culture which isn't one of burnout as well. And I think that's important for us, where every member of staff, we've got 17 members of staff, every member of staff gets clinical supervision. Every member of staff, we're in a space where we can have reflective spaces. We're part of an employee scheme as well, externally, which can offer therapeutic support and advice as well. So I think I care a lot about making sure that with a lot of the work that we do, that actually our staff are in a good position. I
guess our conversation's focused on the kind of external facing side, working with communities and funders and other stuff. Maybe we'll do a round two at some point of how you look after people in the organization and think about that leadership and culture and stuff like that. Is there anything else anything you want to say to the listener before we wrap up?
I mean, I think what I would say is that it's a really difficult time, right? We know we're in a cost of living crisis. And my charity is no different in terms of trying to work out how we keep the lights on, and therefore you can find yourself spreading yourself quite thinly at times. I think CEOs are in this unique position where we're the only ones who wake up every morning with a particular figure in our head that we need to keep going for, to keep the lights on. It can be lonely. I'm fortunate that I've got really good trustees I'm accountable to. And there's mechanisms I have to try and keep myself sane. I've mentioned it. I like to run. And I suppose my thing is, I never want to be the type of person. I've got 3 children. I don't want my kids to ever turn around and say, Dad, you were never around, and even when I'm around, am I really truly present? There's this type of stuff which I think about a lot. So I suppose my encouragement to CEOs and charity leaders is that, if you're not looking after yourself, that will trickle down into the charity. So quite selfishly, make sure you've got time for yourself and make sure you've got time for your family or whatever it is. because the culture is always set by the leader.
Mm.
And therefore, if the leader's not in a great place, it will show up in the charity. So that'd be my only thing. And thank you for an opportunity, Alex, to speak to you. It's really great. Hopefully it's been helpful for people.
Yeah,
so
yeah. No, it's been a real pleasure. Really interesting stuff. Lots of kind of specific details that people can think about how they can apply to their own sort of context as well. So thanks very much, Ben. Thanks for coming on. We'll wrap up there.
No worries. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Charity Impact Podcast. Thank you for giving us your time and attention. I know how precious a resource time is. I hope you enjoyed the show. If I could trouble you for a further 2 minutes of your day, I'd love to hear from you. You can leave a review on your podcast player via ratethispodcast.com/charity. You can engage with us on LinkedIn and Twitter. Just search Charity Impact Podcast, or search Charity Impact Podcast in your browser to find our website, where you can email me directly, and you can subscribe to our email list for the opportunity to submit questions for me to ask upcoming guests. You can also find all the show notes and the previous episodes and links to resources that our guests have recommended there. Until next time, take care and thanks for listening.